Welcome back in part 2 of PlayStation. Anyways, let's continue.
The original PlayStation, released in Japan on December 3, 1994, was the first of the PlayStation series of console and handheld game devices.
It has included successor consoles and upgrades including the NetHeroes, a special black PlayStation with tools and instructions to program PlayStation games and applications. PS1, a smaller version of the original, and the Pocket Station, a handheld, which enhances PlayStation games and also acts as a memory card.
It was part of the fifth generation of video game consoles competing against the Sega Saturn and the Nintendo 64.
By December 2003, the PlayStation and PS1 had shipped a combined total of 102.49 million units, eventually becoming the first video game console to sell 120 million units.
The PlayStation, codenamed PSX, abbreviated as PS, and retroactively PS1 or PS1, is a home video game console developed and marketed by Sony Computer Entertainment.
It was released in Japan on 3 December 1994, followed by North America on 9 September 1995, Europe on 29 September 1995, and other regions following thereafter.
As a fifth-generation console, the PlayStation primarily competed with the Nintendo 64 and the Sega Saturn. Sony began developing the PlayStation after a failed venture with Nintendo to create a CD-ROM peripheral for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in the early 1990s.
The console was primarily designed by Ken Terashi and Sony Computer Entertainment in Japan, while additional development was outsourced in the United Kingdom.
An emphasis on 3D polygon graphics was placed at the forefront of the console's design.
PlayStation game production was designed to be streamlined and inclusive, enticing the support of many third-party developers.
The console proved popular for its extensive game library, popular franchises, low retail price, and aggressive youth marketing, which advertised it as the preferable console for adolescents and adults.
Critically acclaimed games that define the console include Gran Turismo, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, Metal Gear Solid, Tekken 3, and Final Fantasy VII.
Sony ceased production of the PlayStation on 23 March 2006, over 11 years after it had been released, and in the same year the PlayStation 3 debuted.
More than 4,000 PlayStation games were released, with cumulative sales of 962 million units.
The PlayStation signaled Sony's rise to power in the video game industry.
It received acclaim and sold strongly. In less than a decade, it became the first computer entertainment platform to ship over 100 million units.
Its use of compact discs heralded the game industry's transition from cartridges.
The PlayStation's success led to a line of successors, beginning with the PlayStation 2 in 2000.
In the same year, Sony released a smaller and cheaper model, the PS1. The PlayStation was conceived by Ken Terashi, a Sony executive who managed the hardware engineering division and was later dubbed the father of the PlayStation.
Terashi's interest in working with video games stemmed from seeing his daughter play games on Nintendo's Famicom.
Kutarashi convinced Nintendo to use his SPC 700 sound processor in the Super Nintendo Entertainment System (SNES) through a demonstration of the processor's capabilities.
His willingness to work with Nintendo was derived from both his admiration of the Famicom and conviction in video game consoles becoming the main home-use entertainment systems.
Although Kutarashi was nearly fired because he worked with Nintendo without Sony's knowledge, President Norio Oga recognized the potential in Kutarashi's chip and decided to keep him as a protege. The inception of the PlayStation dates back to a 1988 joint venture between Nintendo and Sony.
Nintendo had produced floppy disk technology to complement cartridges in the form of the Family Computer Disk System and wanted to continue this complementary storage strategy for the SNES.
Since Sony was already contracted to produce the SPC 700 sound processor for the SNES, Nintendo contracted Sony to develop a CD-ROM add-on, tentatively titled the PlayStation or SNES CD.
The PlayStation name had already been trademarked by Yamaha, but Nahayuki Iri liked it so much that he agreed to acquire it for an undisclosed sum rather than search for an alternative.
Sony was keen to obtain a foothold in the rapidly expanding video game market.
Having been the primary manufacturer of the MSX home computer format, Sony had wanted to use their experience in consumer electronics to produce their own video game hardware.
Although the initial agreement between Nintendo and Sony was about producing a CD-ROM drive add-on, Sony had also planned to develop a SNES-compatible Sony-branded console.
This iteration was intended to be more of a home entertainment system, playing both SNES cartridges in the new CD format named the Super Disc, which Sony would design.
Under the agreement, Sony would retain sole international rights to every Super Disc game, giving them a large degree of control despite Nintendo's leading position in the video game market.
Furthermore, Sony would also be the sole benefactor of licensing related to music and film software that it had been aggressively pursuing as a secondary application.
The PlayStation was to be announced at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show, CES, in Las Vegas.
However, Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi was wary of Sony's increasing leverage at this point and deemed the original 1988 contract unacceptable upon realizing it essentially handed Sony control over all games written on the SNES CD-ROM format.
Although Nintendo was dominant in the video game market, Sony possessed a superior research and development department.
Wanting to protect Nintendo's existing licensing structure, Yamauchi cancelled all plans for the joint Nintendo-Sony SNES CD attachment without telling Sony.
He sent Nintendo of America President Minoru Arakawa, his son-in-law, and Chairman Howard Lincoln to Amsterdam to form a more favorable contract with Dutch conglomerate Philips, Sony's rival.
This contract would give Nintendo total control over their licenses on all Philips-produced machines.
Kutarashi and Nahayuki Iri, Sony's director of public relations at the time, learned of Nintendo's actions 2 days before the CES was due to begin.
Kutarashi telephoned numerous contacts, including Philips, to no avail.
On the first day of the CES, Sony announced their partnership with Nintendo and their new console, the PlayStation.
At 9 a.m. on the next day, in what has been called the greatest ever betrayal in the industry, Howard Lincoln stepped onto the stage and revealed that Nintendo was now allied with Philips and would abandon their work with Sony.
Incensed by Nintendo's renouncement, Oga and Futarashi decided that Sony would develop their own console.
Nintendo's contract breaking was met with consternation in the Japanese business community, as they had broken an unwritten law of native companies not turning against each other in favor of foreign ones.
Sony's American branch considered allying with Sega to produce a CD-ROM-based machine called the Sega Multimedia Entertainment System. But the Sega Board of Directors in Tokyo vetoed the idea when Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske presented them the proposal.
Kalinske recalled them saying, "That's a stupid idea. Sony doesn't know how to make hardware. They don't know how to make software either. Why would we want to do this?"
Whoa!
Sony halted their research, but decided to develop what it had developed with Nintendo and Sega into a console, based on the SNES. Despite the tumultuous events at the 1991 CES, negotiations between Nintendo and Sony were still ongoing.
A deal was proposed. The PlayStation would still have a port for SNES games on the condition that it would still use Futarashi's audio chip and that Nintendo would own the rights and receive the bulk of the profits.
Roughly 200 prototype machines were created and some software entered development.
Many within Sony were still opposed to their involvement in the video game industry, with some resenting Futarashi for jeopardizing the company.
Futarashi remained adamant that Sony not retreat from the growing industry and that a deal with Nintendo would never work.
Knowing that they had to take decisive action, Sony severed all ties with Nintendo on May 1992.
To determine the fate of the PlayStation project, Oga chaired a meeting in June 1992, consisting of Futarashi and several senior Sony board members.
Futarashi unveiled a proprietary CD-ROM-based system he had been secretly working on, which played games with immersive 3D graphics.
Futarashi was confident that his LSI chip could accommodate 1 million logic gates, which exceeded the capabilities of Sony's semiconductor division at the time.
Despite gaining Oga's enthusiasm, there remained opposition from a majority present at the meeting.
Older Sony executives also opposed it, who saw Nintendo and Sega as toy manufacturers.
The opposers felt the game industry was too culturally offbeat and asserted that Sony should remain a central player in the audio-visual industry, where companies were familiar with one another and could conduct civilized business negotiations.
After Futarashi reminded him of the humiliation he suffered from Nintendo, Oga retained the project and became one of Futarashi's most staunch supporters. Oga shifted Futarashi and 9 of his team from Sony's main headquarters to Sony Music Entertainment Japan, SMEJ, a subsidiary of the main Sony group, so as to retain the project and maintain relationships with Philips for the MMCD development project.
The involvement of SMEJ proved crucial to the PlayStation's early development, as the process of manufacturing games on CD-ROM format was similar to that used for audio CDs, with which Sony's music division had considerable experience.
While at SMEJ, Futarashi worked with Epic/Sony Records founder Shigeru Maruyama and Akira Sato, both later became vice presidents of the division that ran the PlayStation business.
Sony Computer Entertainment, SCE, was jointly established by Sony and SMEJ to handle the company's ventures into the video game industry.
On 27 October 1993, Sony publicly announced that it was entering the game console market with a PlayStation.
A According to Maruyama, there was uncertainty over whether the console should primarily focus on 2D, sprite-based graphics or 3D polygon graphics.
After Sony witnessed the success of Sega's Virtua Fighter 1993 in Japanese arcades, the direction of the PlayStation became instantly clear, and 3D polygon graphics became the console's primary focus.
SCE President Teruhisa Takenaka expressed gratitude for Sega's timely release of Virtua Fighter as it proved, just at the right time, that making games with 3D imagery was possible.
Maruyama claimed that Sony further wanted to emphasize the new console's ability to utilize Red Book audio from the CD-ROM format in its games alongside high-quality visuals and gameplay. Wishing to distance the project from the failed enterprise with Nintendo, Sony initially branded the PlayStation V, PlayStation X, PSX.
Sony formed their European division and North American division, known as Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, SCEE, and Sony Computer Entertainment America, SCEA, in January and May 1995.
The divisions plan to market the new console under the alternative branding, PSX, following the negative feedback regarding PlayStation in focus group studies.
Early advertising prior to the console's launch in North America referenced PSX, but the term was scrapped before launch.
The console was not marketed with Sony's name, in contrast to Nintendo's consoles.
According to Phil Harrison, much of Sony's upper management feared that the Sony brand would be tarnished if associated with a console, which they considered a toy.
Since Sony had no experience in game development, it had to rely on the support of third-party game developers.
This was in contrast to Sega and Nintendo, which had versatile and well-equipped in-house software divisions for their arcade games and could easily port successful games to their home consoles.
Recent consoles like the Atari Jaguar and 3DO suffered low sales due to a lack of developer support, prompting Sony to redouble their efforts in gaining the endorsement of arcade-savvy developers.
A team from Epic Sony visited more than 100 companies throughout Japan in May 1993 in hopes of attracting game creators with a PlayStation's technological appeal.
Sony found that many disliked Nintendo's practices, such as favoring their own games over others.
Through a series of negotiations, Sony acquired initial support from Namco, Konami, and Williams Entertainment, as well as 250 other development teams in Japan alone.
Namco in particular was interested in developing for PlayStation, since Namco rivaled Sega in the arcade market.
Attaining these companies secured influential games such as Ridge Racer 1993 and Mortal Kombat 3 1995. Ridge Racer being one of the most popular arcade games at the time, and it was already confirmed behind closed doors that it would be the PlayStation's first game by December 1993. Despite Namco being a long-standing Nintendo developer.
Namco's research managing director Shigechi Nakamura met with Kutarashi in 1993 to discuss the preliminary PlayStation specifications, with Namco subsequently basing the Namco System 11 arcade board on PlayStation hardware and developing Tekken to compete with Virtua Fighter.
The System 11 launched in arcade several months before the PlayStation's release, with the arcade release of Tekken in September 1994.
Despite securing the support of various Japanese studios, Sony had no developers of their own by the time the PlayStation was in development.
This changed in 1993 when Sony acquired the Liverpudlian company Psygnosis, later renamed SCE Liverpool, for US $48 million, securing their first in-house development team.
The acquisition meant that Sony could have more launch games ready for the PlayStation's release in Europe and North America.
Ian Hetherington, Psygnosis co-founder, was disappointed after receiving early builds of the PlayStation and recalled that the console was not fit for purpose until his team got involved with it.
Hetherington frequently clashed with Sony executives over broader ideas. At one point it was suggested that a television with a built-in PlayStation be produced.
In the months leading up to the PlayStation's launch, Psygnosis had around 500 full-time staff working on games and assisting with software development.
The purchase of Psygnosis marked another turning point for the PlayStation as it played a vital role in creating the console's development kits.
While Sony had provided NITFAR 4000-based Sony News workstations for PlayStation development, Psygnosis employees disliked the thought of developing on these expensive workstations and asked Bristol-based SN Systems to create an alternative PC-based development system.
Andy Paviraj and Martin Day, owners of SN Systems, had previously supplied development hardware for other consoles such as the Mega Drive, Atari ST, and the SNES.
When Psygnosis arranged an audience for SN Systems with Sony's Japanese executives at the January 1994 CES in Las Vegas, Paviraj and Day presented their prototype of a condensed development kit, which could run on an ordinary personal computer with 2 extension boards.
Impressed, Sony decided to abandon their plans for a workstation-based development system in favor of SN Systems, thus securing a cheaper and more efficient method for designing software.
An order of over 600 systems followed, and SN Systems supplied Sony with additional software such as an assembler, linker, and a debugger.
SN Systems produced development kits for future PlayStation systems, including the PlayStation 2, and was bought out by Sony in 2005. Sony strived to make game production as streamlined and inclusive as possible, in contrast to the relatively isolated approach of Sega and Nintendo.
Phil Harrison, representative director of SCEE, believed that Sony's emphasis on developer assistance reduced most time-consuming aspects of development,
as well as providing programming libraries. SCE headquarters in London, California, and Tokyo housed technical support teams that could work closely with third-party developers if needed.
Sony did not favor their own over non-Sony products. Unlike Nintendo, Peter Molyneux of Bullfrog Productions admired Sony's open-handed approach to software. Developers applauded their decision to use PCs as a development platform, remarking that it was like being released from jail in terms of the freedom you have.
Another strategy that helped attract software developers was the PlayStation's use of the CD-ROM format instead of traditional cartridges.
Nintendo cartridges were expensive to manufacture, and the company controlled all production, prioritizing their own games. While inexpensive, compact disc manufacturing occurred at dozens of locations around the world.
The PlayStation's architecture and interconnectability with PCs was beneficial to many software developers.
The use of the programming language C proved useful, as it safeguarded future compatibility of the machine, should developers decide to make further hardware revisions.
Despite the inherent flexibility, some developers found themselves restricted due to the console's lack of RAM.
While working on data builds of the PlayStation, Molyneux observed that its mixed processor was not quite as bullish compared to that of a fast PC, and said that it took his team 2 weeks to port their PC code to the PlayStation development kits and another fortnight to achieve a 4-fold speed increase.
An engineer from Ocean Software, one of Europe's largest game developers at the time, thought that allocating RAM was a challenging aspect, given the 3.5 megabyte restriction.
TaBNWNE said that while it would have been easy to double the amount of RAM for the PlayStation, the development team refrained from doing so to keep the retail cost down.
TaBNWNE saw the biggest challenge in developing the system to be balancing the conflicting goals of high performance, low cost, and being easy to program for, and felt he and his team were successful in this regard. Its technical specifications were finalized in 1993 and its design during 1994.
The PlayStation name and its final design were confirmed during a press conference on May 10, 1994, although the price and release dates have not been disclosed yet.
Sony released the PlayStation in Japan on 3 December 1994, a week after the release of the Sega Saturn, at a price of 39,800 yen.
Sales in Japan began with a stunning success with long queues in shops.
Oda later recalled that he realized how important PlayStation had become for Sony when friends and relatives begged for consoles for their children.
PlayStation sold 100,000 units on the first day and 2 million units within 6 months, although the Saturn outsold the PlayStation in the first few weeks due to the success of Virtua Fighter.
By the end of 1994, 300,000 PlayStation units were sold in Japan compared to 500,000 Saturn units.
A gray market emerged for PlayStations shipped from Japan to North America and Europe, with buyers of such consoles paying up to £700.
Before the release in North America, Sega and Sony presented their consoles at the first Electronic Entertainment Expo, E3, in Los Angeles on 11 May 1995.
At their keynote presentation, Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske revealed that their Saturn console would be released immediately to select retailers at a price of $399.
Next came Sony's turn. Olaf Olafsson, the head of SCEA, summoned Steve Race, the head of development, to the conference stage, who said $299 and left the audience with a round of applause.
Whoa! The attention to the Sony conference was further bolstered by the surprise appearance of Michael Jackson in the showcase of highly anticipated games, including Wipeout, 1995, Ridge Racer and Tekken, 1994.
In addition, Sony announced that no games would be bundled with a console. Although the Saturn had released early in the United States to gain an advantage over the PlayStation, the surprise launch upset many retailers who were not informed in time, harming sales.
Some retailers such as KB Toys responded by dropping the Saturn entirely.
The PlayStation went on sale in North America on 9 September 1995.
It sold more units within 2 days than the Saturn had in 5 months, with almost all of the initial shipment of 100,000 units sold in advance and shops across the country running out of consoles and accessories.
The well-received Ridge Racer contributed to the PlayStation's early success, with some critics considering it superior to Sega's arcade counterpart Daytona USA 1994, as did Battle Arena to Shinden 1995.
There were over 100,000 pre-orders, placed and 17 games available on the market by the time of the PlayStation's American launch, in comparison to the Saturn VI launch games.
The PlayStation, released in Europe on 29 September 1995 and in Australia on 15 November 1995.
By November it had already outsold the Saturn by 3-1 in the United Kingdom, where Sony had allocated a £20 million marketing budget during the Christmas season, compared to Sega's £4 million.
Sony found early success in the United Kingdom by securing listings with independent shop owners as well as prominent high street chains such as Comet and Argos.
Within its first year, the PlayStation secured over 20% of the entire American video game market.
From September to the end of 1995, sales in the United States amounted to 800,000 units, giving the PlayStation a commanding lead over the other fifth-generation consoles, though the SNES and Mega Drive from the fourth generation still outsold it.
Sony reported that the attach rate of sold games and consoles was 4-1.
To meet increasing demand, Sony chartered jumbo jets and ramped up production in Europe and North America.
By early 1996, the PlayStation had grossed $2 billion, equivalent to $4.01 billion in 2024, from worldwide hardware and software sales.
By late 1996, sales in Europe totaled 2.2 million units, including 700,000 in the UK.
Approximately 400 PlayStation games were in development, compared to around 200 games being developed for the Saturn and 60 for the Nintendo 64.
In India, the PlayStation was launched in test market during 1999 to 2000 across Sony showrooms, selling 100 units.
Sony finally launched the console, PS1 model, countrywide on 24 January 2002 with a price of 7,990 Indian rupees and 26 games available from start.
PlayStation was also doing well in markets where it was never officially released.
For example, in Brazil, due to the registration of the trademark by a third company, the console could not be released, which was why the market was taken over by the officially distributed Sega Saturn during the first period, but as the Sega console withdraws, PlayStation imports and large piracy increased.
In another market, China, the most popular 32-bit console was Sega Saturn, but after leaving the market, PlayStation grown with a base of 300,000 users until January 2000, although Sony China did not have plans to release it.
When September 1995 arrived and Sony's PlayStation roared out of the gate, things immediately felt different than they did with the Saturn launch earlier that year. Sega dropped the Saturn $100 to match the PlayStation's $299 debut price, but sales weren't even close. PlayStations flew out the door as fast as we could get them in stock. Lee Hutchinson of Ars Technica, a Babbage's employee in 1995, recalling how PlayStation pre-orders greatly outnumbered Saturn sales at his shop.
The PlayStation was backed by a successful marketing campaign, allowing Sony to gain an early foothold in Europe and North America.
Initially, PlayStation demographics were skewed towards adults, but the audience broadened after the first price drop.
While the Saturn was positioned towards 18 to 34-year-olds, the PlayStation was initially marketed exclusively towards teenagers.
Executives from both Sony and Sega reasoned that because younger players typically looked up to older, more experienced players, advertising targeted at teens and adults would draw them in too.
Additionally, Sony found that adults reacted best to advertising aimed at teenagers. We close surmised that people who started to grow into adulthood regressed and became 17 again when they played video games.
The console was marketed with advertising slogans still as "Live in your world," "Play in ours, live in your world," "Play in ours," and "You are not ready."
The 4 geometric shapes were derived from the symbols for the 4 buttons on the controller.
Klo thought that by invoking such provocative statements, gamers would respond to the contrary and say, "Oh, let me show you how ready I am."
As the console's appeal enlarged, Sony's marketing efforts broadened from their earlier focus on mature players to specifically target younger children as well. Shortly after the PlayStation's release in Europe, Sony tasked marketing manager Jeff Glendinning with assessing the desires of a new target audience.
Skeptical over Nintendo and Sega's reliance on television campaigns, Glendinning theorized that young adults transitioning from 4th generation consoles would feel neglected by marketing directed at children and teenagers.
Recognizing the influence early 1990s underground clubbing and rave culture had on young people, especially in the United Kingdom, Glendinning felt that the culture had become mainstream enough to help cultivate PlayStation's emerging identity.
Sony partnered with prominent nightclub owners such as Ministry of Sound and festival promoters to organize dedicated PlayStation areas where demonstrations of select games could be tested.
Sheffield-based graphic design studio The Designers Republic was contracted by Sony to produce promotional materials aimed at a fashionable, club-going audience.
Psygnosis Whiteout in particular became associated with nightclub culture as it was widely featured in venues.
By 1997, there were 52 nightclubs in the United Kingdom with dedicated PlayStation rooms.
Glendinning recalled that he had discreetly used at least £100,000 a year in slush fund money to invest in impromptu marketing.
In 1996, Sony expanded their CD production facilities in the United States due to the high demand for PlayStation games, increasing their monthly output from 4 million discs to 6.5 million discs.
This was necessary because PlayStation sales were running at twice the rate of Saturn sales, and its sales dramatically increased when both consoles dropped in price to $199 that year.
The PlayStation also outsold the Saturn at a similar ratio in Europe during 1996, with 2.2 million consoles sold in the region by the end of the year.
Sales figures for PlayStation hardware and software only increased following the launch of the Nintendo 64.
TaBNWNE speculated that the Nintendo 64 launch had actually helped PlayStation sales by raising public awareness of the gaming market through Nintendo's added marketing efforts.
Despite this, the PlayStation took longer to achieve dominance in Japan.
TaBNWNE said that, even after the PlayStation and Saturn had been on the market for nearly 2 years, the competition between them was still very close. And neither console had led in sales for any meaningful length of time. By 1998, Sega, encouraged by their declining market share and significant financial losses, launched the Dreamcast as a last-ditch attempt to stay in the industry.
Although its launch was successful, the technically superior 128-bit console was unable to subdue Sony's dominance in the industry.
Sony still held 60% of the overall video game market share in North America at the end of 1999.
Sega's initial confidence in their new console was undermined when Japanese sales were lower than expected, with disgruntled Japanese consumers reportedly returning their Dreamcasts in exchange for PlayStation software.
On 2 March 1999, Sony officially revealed details of the PlayStation 2, which Teraji announced would feature a graphics processor designed to push more raw polygons than any console in history, effectively rivaling most supercomputers.
The PlayStation continued to sell strongly at the turn of the new millennium. In June 2000, Sony released the PS1, a smaller, redesigned variant which went on to outsell all other consoles in that year, including the PlayStation 2.
In 2005, PlayStation became the first console to ship 100 million units, with the PlayStation 2 later achieving this faster than its predecessor.
The combined successes of both PlayStation consoles led to Sega retiring the Dreamcast in 2001 and abandoning the console business entirely.
The PlayStation was eventually discontinued on 23 March 2006, over 11 years after its release, and less than a year before the debut of the PlayStation 3. The main microprocessor is a R3000 CPU, made by OSI Logic, operating at a clock rate of 33.8688 MHz and 30 MIPS.
This 32-bit CPU relies heavily on the COP2 3D and Matrix Math coprocessor on the same die to provide the necessary speed to render complex 3D graphics.
The role of a separate GPU chip is to draw 2D polygons and apply shading and textures to them, the rasterization stage of the graphics pipeline.
Sony's custom 16-bit sound chip supports ADPCM sources with up to 24 sound channels and offers a sampling rate of up to 44.1 kHz in music sequencing.
It features 2 MB of main RAM, with an additional 1 MB of video RAM.
The PlayStation has a maximum color depth of 16.7 million true colors with 32 levels of transparency and unlimited color lookup tables.
The PlayStation can output composite, S-video or RGB video signals through its AV multi-connector, with older models also having RCA connectors for composite. Displaying resolutions from 256 by 224 to 640 by 480 pixels.
Different games can use different resolutions.
Earlier models also had proprietary parallel and serial ports that could be used to connect accessories or multiple consoles together. These were later removed due to a lack of usage. The PlayStation uses a proprietary video compression unit, MDEC, which is integrated into the CPU and allows for the presentation of full motion video at a higher quality than other consoles of its generation.
Unusual for the time, the PlayStation lacks a dedicated 2D graphics processor. 2D elements are instead calculated as polygons by the Geometry Transfer Engine, GTE, so that they can be processed and displayed on screen by the GPU.
While running, the GPU can also generate a total of 4,000 sprites and 180,000 polygons per second, in addition to 360,000 per second flat-shaded. The PlayStation went through a number of variants during its production run.
Externally, the most notable change was the gradual reduction in the number of external connectors from the rear of the unit.
This started with the original Japanese launch units. The SCPH-1000, released on 3 December 1994, was the only model that had an S-video port, as it was removed from the next model.
Subsequent models saw a reduction in number of parallel ports, with a final version only retaining one serial port.
Sony marketed a development kit for amateur developers known as the Net, meaning let's do it together in Japanese.
It was launched in June 1996 in Japan, and following public interest, was released the next year in other countries.
The Net allowed hobbyists to create their own games and upload them via an online forum run by Sony.
The console was only available to buy through an ordering service and with the necessary documentation and software to program PlayStation games and applications through C programming compilers.
On 7 July 2000, Sony released the PS1, stylized as PS1 or PS1, a smaller, redesigned version of the original PlayStation.
It was the highest-selling console through the end of the year, outselling all other consoles, including the PlayStation 2.
In 2002, Sony released a 5-inch, 130mm LCD screen add-on for the PS1, referred to as the Combo Pack.
It also included a car cigarette lighter adapter, adding an extra layer of portability.
Production of the LCD Combo Pack ceased in 2004 when the popularity of the PlayStation began to wane in markets outside Japan.
A total of 28.15 million PS1 units had been sold by the time it was discontinued in March 2006.
3 iterations of the PlayStation's controller were released over the console's lifespan.
The first controller, the PlayStation controller, was released alongside the PlayStation in December 1994.
It featured 4 individual directional buttons, as opposed to a conventional D-pad, a pair of shoulder buttons on both sides, start and select buttons in the center, and 4 face buttons consisting of simple geometric shapes. A green triangle, red circle, blue cross, and a pink square, triangle, circle, cross, square.
Rather than depicting traditionally used letters or numbers onto its buttons, the PlayStation controller established a trademark, which would be incorporated heavily into the PlayStation brand.
Yugodo, the designer of the original PlayStation controller, said that the circle and cross represent yes and no, respectively, though this layout is reversed in Western versions. The triangle symbolizes a point of view and the square is equated to a sheet of paper to be used to access menus.
The European and North American models of the original PlayStation controllers are roughly 10% larger than its Japanese variant. To account for the fact the average person in those regions has larger hands than the average Japanese person.
Sony's first analog gamepad, the PlayStation Analog Joystick, often erroneously referred to as the Sony Flight Stick, was first released in Japan in April 1996.
Featuring 2 parallel joysticks, it uses potentiometer technology previously used on consoles such as the Vectrex. Instead of relying on binary 8-way switches, the controller detects minute angular changes through the entire range of motion.
The stick also features a thumb-operated digital hat switch on the right joystick, corresponding to the traditional D-pad, and used for instances when simple digital movements were necessary.
The analog joystick sold poorly in Japan due to its high cost and cumbersome size.
The increasing popularity of 3D games prompted Sony to add analog sticks to its controller, designed to give users more freedom over their movements in virtual 3D environments.
The first official analog controller, the dual analog controller, was revealed to the public in a small glass booth at the 1996 PlayStation Expo in Japan. and released in April 1997 to coincide with the Japanese releases of analog-capable games Toggle 2 and Bushido Blade.
In addition to the two analog sticks, which also introduced two new buttons mapped to clicking in the analog sticks. The dual analog controller features an analog button LED beneath the start and select buttons which toggles analog functionality on or off.
The controller also features rumble support, though Sony decided that haptic feedback would be removed from all overseas iterations before the United States release.
A Sony spokesman stated that the feature was removed for manufacturing reasons, although rumors circulated that Nintendo had attempted to legally block the release of the controller outside Japan due to similarities with a Nintendo 64 controller's rumble pack.
However, a Nintendo spokesman denied that Nintendo took legal action.
Next Generation's Chris Charla theorized that Sony dropped vibration feedback to keep the price of the controller down. In November 1997, Sony introduced the DualShock controller.
Its name derives from its use of two dual vibration motors, shock.
Unlike its predecessor, its analog sticks feature textured rubber grips, longer handles, slightly different shoulder buttons, and has rumble feedback, included as standard on all versions.
The DualShock later replaced its predecessors as the default controller.
Sony released a series of peripherals to add extra layers of functionality to the PlayStation.
Such peripherals include memory cards, the PlayStation mouse, the PlayStation Link cable, the multiplayer adapter, a 4-player multi-tap, the memory drive, a disk drive for 3.5-inch floppy disks, the gun con, a light gun, and the Glastron, a monoscopic head-mounted display.
Released exclusively in Japan, the Pocket Station is a memory card peripheral which acts as a miniature personal digital assistant.
The device features a monochrome liquid crystal display, LCD, infrared communication capability, a real-time clock, built-in flash memory, and sound capability.
Sharing similarities with the Dreamcast's VMU peripheral, the Pocket Station was typically distributed with certain PlayStation games, enhancing them with added features.
The Pocket Station proved popular in Japan, selling over 5 million units.
Sony planned to release the peripheral outside Japan, but the release was cancelled, despite receiving promotion in Europe and North America. In addition to playing games, most PlayStation models are equipped to play CD audio.
The Asian model SCPH-5903 can also play video CDs.
Like most CD players, the PlayStation can play songs in a programmed order, shuffle the playback order of the disc, and repeat one song or the entire disc.
Later PlayStation models use a music visualization function called SoundScope.
This function, as well as a memory card manager, is accessed by starting the console without either inserting a game or closing the CD tray, thereby accessing a graphical user interface, GUI, for the PlayStation iOS.
The GUI for the PS1 and PlayStation differ depending on the firmware version. The original PlayStation GUI had a dark blue background with rainbow graffiti used as buttons, while the early PAL PlayStation and PS1 GUI had a gray, blocked background with two icons in the middle.
PlayStation emulation is versatile and can be run on numerous modern devices.
Bleed was a commercial emulator which was released for IBM-compatible PCs and the Dreamcast in 1999.
It was notable for being aggressively marketed during the PlayStation's lifetime and was the center of multiple controversial lawsuits filed by Sony.
TaBNWNE was programmed in assembly language, which allowed it to emulate PlayStation games with improved visual fidelity, enhanced resolutions, and filtered textures that was not possible on original hardware.
Sony sued TaBNWNE 2 days after its release, citing copyright infringement and accusing the company of engaging in unfair competition and patent infringement by allowing use of PlayStation BIOSes on a Sega console.
TaBNWNE were subsequently forced to shut down in November 2001.
Sony was aware that using CDs for game distribution could have left games vulnerable to piracy due to the growing popularity of CDR and optical disc drives with burning capability.
To preclude illegal copying, a proprietary process for PlayStation disc manufacturing was developed that, in conjunction with an augmented optical drive in Tiger H/E assembly, prevented burned copies of games from booting on an unmodified console.
Specifically, all genuine PlayStation discs were printed with a small section of delivered irregular data, which the PlayStation's optical pickup was capable of detecting and decoding.
Consoles would not boot game discs without a specific wobble frequency contained in the data of the disc per gap sector. The same system was also used to encode discs' regional lockouts.
This signal was within Redbook CD tolerances, so PlayStation disc's actual content could still be read by a conventional disc drive. However, the disc drive could not detect the wobble frequency, therefore duplicating the discs, omitting it. Since the laser pickup system of any optical disc drive would interpret this wobble as an oscillation of the disc surface and compensate for it in the reading process. Early PlayStations, particularly early 1000 models, experienced skipping full motion video or physical ticking noises from the unit.
The problem stemmed from poorly placed vents leading to overheating in some environments, causing the plastic moldings inside the console to warp slightly and create knock-on effects with a laser assembly.
The solution is to sit the console on a surface which dissipates heat efficiently in a well-vented area or raise the unit up slightly from its resting surface.
Sony representatives also recommended unplugging the PlayStation when it is not in use, as the system draws in a small amount of power and therefore heat, even when turned off.
The first batch of PlayStations use a KSM 448AM laser unit, whose case and movable parts are all built out of plastic.
Over time, the plastic lens sled rail wears out, usually unevenly, due to friction.
The placement of the laser unit close to the power supply accelerates wear due to the additional heat, which makes the plastic more vulnerable to friction.
Eventually, one side of the lens sled will become so worn that the laser can tilt, no longer pointing directly at the CD. After this, games will no longer load due to data read errors.
Sony fixed the problem by making the sled out of die-cast metal and placing the laser unit further away from the power supply on later PlayStation models. Due to an engineering oversight, the PlayStation does not produce a proper signal on several older models of televisions, causing the display to flicker or bounce around the screen.
Sony decided not to change the console design, since only a small percentage of PlayStation owners used such televisions, and instead gave consumers the option of sending their PlayStation unit to a Sony service center to have an official mod chip installed, allowing play on older televisions.
The PlayStation featured a diverse game library, which grew to appeal to all types of players.
Critically acclaimed PlayStation games included Final Fantasy VII, 1997, Crash Bandicoot, 1996, Spur of the Dragon, 1998, Metal Gear Solid, 1998, all of which became established franchises.
Final Fantasy VII is credited with allowing role-playing games to gain mass market appeal outside Japan, and is considered one of the most influential and greatest video games ever made.
The PlayStation's best-selling game is Gran Turismo 1997, which sold 10.85 million units.
After the PlayStation's discontinuation in 2006, the cumulative software shipment was 962 million units. Following its 1994 launch in Japan, early games included Ridge Racer, Crime Crackers, King's Field, Motor 2 Grand Prix, Toshinden, that is, Battle Arena Toshinden, and Kilik, the Blood.
The first two games available at its later North American launch were Jumping Flash 1995 and Ridge Racer, with Jumping Flash heralded as an ancestor for 3D graphics in console gaming.
Wipeout, Air Combat, Twisted Metal, Warhawk, and Destruction Derby were among the popular first-year games, and the first to be reissued as part of Sony's Greatest Hits or Platinum range. At the time of the PlayStation's first Christmas season, Psygnosis had produced around 70% of its launch catalog. Their breakthrough racing game Wipeout was acclaimed for its techno soundtrack and helped raise awareness of Britain's underground music community.
Eidos Interactive's action-adventure game Tomb Raider contributed substantially to the success of the console in 1996, with its main protagonist Lara Croft becoming an early gaming icon and garnering unprecedented media promotion.
Licensed tie-in video games of popular films were also prevalent. Argonaut Games' 2001 adaptation of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone went on to sell over 8 million copies late in the console's lifespan.
Third-party developers committed largely to the console's wide-ranging game catalog even after the launch of the PlayStation 2. Some of the notable exclusives in this era include Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Fear Effect 2, Retro Helix, Siphon Filter 3, C12, Final Resistance, Dance Dance Revolution, Dynamics, and Digimon World 3.
Sony assisted with game reprints as late as 2008 with Metal Gear Solid, the Essential Collection, this being the last PlayStation game officially released and licensed by Sony. Initially, in the United States, PlayStation games were packaged in long cardboard boxes, similar to non-Japanese 3DO and Saturn games.
Sony later switched to the jewel case format typically used for audio CDs and Japanese video games, as this format took up less retailer shelf space, which was at a premium due to the large number of PlayStation games being released, and focus testing showed that most consumers preferred this format.
The PlayStation was mostly well received upon release.
Critics in the West generally welcomed the new console. The staff of Next Generation reviewed the PlayStation a few weeks after its North American launch, where they commented that, while the CPU is fairly average, the supplementary custom hardware, such as the GPU and sound processor, is stunningly powerful.
They praised the PlayStation's focus on 3D and complimented the comfort of its controller and the convenience of its memory cards.
Giving the system 4.5 out of 5 stars, they concluded, to succeed in this extremely cutthroat market, you need a combination of great hardware, great games, and great marketing. Whether by skill, luck, or just deep pockets, Sony has scored 3 out of 3 in the first salvo of this war.
Albert Kim from Entertainment Weekly praised the PlayStation as a technological marvel, rivaling that of Sega and Nintendo.
Famicom Session scored the console a 19 out of 40, lower than the Saturn's 24 out of 40 in May 1995.
In a 1997 year-end review, a team of 5 electronic gaming monthly editors gave the PlayStation scores of 9.5, 8.5, 9.0, 9.0, and 9.5 for all 5 editors. The highest score they gave to any of the 5 consoles reviewed in the issue.
They lauded the breadth and quality of the game's library, saying it had vastly improved over previous years due to developers mastering the system's capabilities. In addition to Sony revising their stance on 2D and role-playing games.
They also complimented the low price point of the games, compared to the Nintendo 64s, and noted that it was the only console on the market that could be relied upon to deliver a solid stream of games for the coming year. Primarily due to third-party developers almost unanimously favoring it over its competitors. SCE was an upstart in the video game industry in late 1994, as the video game market in the early 1990s was dominated by Nintendo and Sega.
Nintendo had been the clear leader in the industry since the introduction of the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1985, and the Nintendo 64 was initially expected to maintain this position.
The PlayStation's target audience included the generation which was the first to grow up with mainstream video games, along with 18 to 29-year-olds who were not the primary focus of Nintendo.
By the late 1990s, Sony became a highly regarded console brand due to the PlayStation, with a significant lead over second-place Nintendo, while Sega was relegated to a distant third.
The PlayStation became the first computer entertainment platform to ship over 100 million units worldwide, with many critics attributing the console's success to third-party developers.
It remains the 6th best-selling console of all time as of 2025, with a total of 102.49 million units sold.
Around 7,900 individual games were published for the console during its 11-year lifespan, the second most games ever produced for a console.
Its success resulted in a significant financial boom for Sony, as profits from their video game division contributed to 23%.
Sony's next-generation PlayStation 2, which is backward compatible with the PlayStation's DualShock controller and games, was announced in 1999 and launched in 2000.
The PlayStation's lead in install base and developer support paved the way for the success of its successor, which overcame the earlier launch of the Sega's Dreamcast, and then fended off competition from Microsoft's newcomer Xbox and Nintendo's GameCube.
The PlayStation 2's immense success and failure of the Dreamcast were among the main factors which led to Sega abandoning the console market.
To date, 5 PlayStation Home consoles have been released, which have continued the same numbering scheme, as well as 2 portable systems.
The PlayStation 3 also maintained backward compatibility with original PlayStation discs.
Hundreds of PlayStation games have been digitally re-released on the PlayStation Portable, PlayStation 3, PlayStation Vita, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 5.
The PlayStation has often ranked among the best video game consoles.
In 2018, Retro Gamer named it the 3rd best console, crediting its sophisticated 3D capabilities as one of its key factors in gaining mass success, and lauding it as a game changer in every sense possible.
In 2009, IGN ranked the PlayStation the seventh best console in their list, noting its appeal towards older audiences to be a crucial factor in propelling the video game industry, as well as its assistance in transitioning game industry to use the CD-ROM format.
Keith Stewart from The Guardian likewise named it as the seventh best console in 2020, declaring that its success was so profound it ruled the 1990s.
In January 2025, Laurentio Brudesco announced the NS1 project, attempting to reverse engineer PlayStation's motherboard.
Brudesco stated that detailed documentation on the original motherboard was either incomplete or entirely unavailable.
The project was successfully crowdfunded via Kickstarter.
In June, Brudesco manufactured the first working motherboard, promising to bring a fully rooted version with multi-layer routing as well as documentation and design files in the near future.
The success of the PlayStation contributed to the demise of cartridge-based home consoles.
While not the first system to use an optical disc format, it was the first highly successful one, and ended up going head-to-head with a proprietary cartridge-relying Nintendo 64, which the industry had expected to use CDs like PlayStation.
After the demise of the Sega Saturn, Nintendo was left as Sony's main competitor in Western markets.
Nintendo chose not to use CDs for the Nintendo 64. They were likely concerned with a proprietary cartridge format's ability to help enforce copy protection, given their substantial reliance on licensing and exclusive games for their revenue.
Besides their larger capacity, CD-ROMs could be produced in bulk quantities at a much faster rate than ROM cartridges, a week, compared to 2 to 3 months.
Further, the cost of production per unit was far cheaper, allowing Sony to offer games about 40% lower cost to the user compared to ROM cartridges, while still making the same amount of net revenue.
In Japan, Sony published fewer copies of a wide variety of games for the PlayStation as a risk-limiting step, a model that had been used by Sony Music for CD audio discs.
The production flexibility of CD-ROMs meant that Sony could produce larger volumes of popular games to get onto the market quickly, something that could not be done with cartridges due to their manufacturing lead time.
The lower production costs of CD-ROMs also allowed publishers an additional source of profit, budget-price reissues of games, which had already recouped their development costs. Tatanaka remarked in 1996.
Choosing CD-ROM is one of the most important decisions that we made. As I'm sure you understand, PlayStation could just as easily have worked with masked ROM cartridges. The 3D engine and everything, the whole PlayStation format, is independent of the media. But for various reasons, including the economies for the consumer, the ease of the manufacturing, inventory control for the trade, and also the software publishers, we deduced that CD-ROM would be the best media for PlayStation.
The increasing complexity of developing games pushed cartridges to their storage limits and gradually discouraged some third-party developers.
Part of the CD format's appeal to publishers was that they could be produced at a significantly lower cost and offered more production flexibility to meet demand.
As a result, some third-party developers switched to the PlayStation, including Square Enix, whose Final Fantasy VII and Dragon Quest VII respectively had been planned for the Nintendo 64. Both companies later merged to form Square Enix.
Other developers released fewer games for the Nintendo 64, Konami releasing only 13 N64 games but over 50 on the PlayStation.
Nintendo Nintendo 64 game releases were less frequent than the PlayStation's, with many being developed by either Nintendo themselves or second parties such as Rare. The PlayStation Classic is a dedicated video game console made by Sony Interactive Entertainment that emulates PlayStation games.
It was announced in September 2018 at the Tokyo Game Show and released on 3 December 2018, the 24th anniversary of the release of the original console.
As a dedicated console, the PlayStation Classic features 20 pre-installed games. The games run off the open-source emulator PCSX.
The console is bundled with 2 replica wired PlayStation controllers, those without analog sticks, an HDMI cable, and a USB Type-A cable.
Internally, the console uses a MediaTek MT8167A Quad A35 system on a chip, with 4 central processing cores, clocked at 1.5 GHz and a PowerVR GE8300 graphics processing unit.
It includes 16 GB of eMMC flash storage and 1 GB of DDR3 SDRAM.
The PlayStation Classic is 45% smaller than the original console. The PlayStation Classic received negative reviews from critics and was compared unfavorably to Nintendo's rival Nintendo Entertainment System Classic Edition and Super Nintendo Entertainment System Classic Edition.
Criticism was directed at its meager game library, user interface, emulation quality, use of PAL versions for certain games, use of the original controller, and high retail price, though the console's design received praise.
The console sold poorly. Released on July 7, 2000, concurrently with its successor the PlayStation 2, the PS1, stylized as PS1, was a considerably smaller, redesigned version of the original PlayStation video game console.
The PS1 went on to outsell all other consoles, including its successor, throughout the remainder of the year.
It featured 2 main changes from its predecessor, the first being a cosmetic change to the console and the second being the home menu's graphical user interface, GUI, a variation of the GUI previously used only on PAL consoles up to that point. The PS1, officially stylized as PS1 and alternatively spelled PS1 and PS1, is a smaller, redesigned version of the original PlayStation platform.
Dimensions are 38mm by 193mm by 144mm versus 45mm by 260mm by 185mm.
It was released on 7 July 2000 and went on to outsell all other consoles throughout the remainder of the year, including Sony's own PlayStation 2.
The PS1 is fully compatible with all PlayStation software. Compatibility with certain peripherals may vary, however.
The PS1 also had additional changes, including the removal of the parallel and serial ports from the rear of the console, and the removal of a separate reset button. The power button is also labeled as a reset button, executed by double pressing the switch in quick succession. On 2 January 2002, Sony released a bundle set, called The Combo, that included a 5-inch, 130mm LCD screen attachment, SCPH-131, which was initially offered as a separate attachment for the PS1 on 19 September 2000.
The screen itself included built-in stereo speakers, volume and brightness controls, Castro ports for power and AV outputs, and had a headphone jack as well as an AV mini jack for connecting camcorders or other devices. We will continue more about PlayStation in part 3, so stay tuned folks.